Hong Kong, 1980s. It has been a huge metropolis with gleaming skyscrapers. But one of its residential neighborhoods includes this. What is it? Shantytown? Abandoned property? It is different from anything else and looks weird, frightening, and even somehow unearthly. It's a place where houses are literally built on top of each other. The streets are narrow corridors. No sunlight ever shines inside this creepy structure. The population density here is up to 50,000 people on 6.4 acres. Convert that to square miles and we get 3.5 million per square mile. What? No, it is not a mistake. Also, the laws don't work here, but people live here. Though the normal residential high-rises of Hong Kong are literally across the street. What the hell is going on here? Kowloon Walled City, the densest city in history. From an aerial view, Kowloon looks like something otherworldly, like a strange giant beehive. It stands out so strikingly from the rest of the city. But if we look down there, we see ordinary people living ordinary lives. Well, maybe not quite ordinary. Let's see. Kowloon is only called a city, but it's not even the size of a city block. It's 690 by 390 feet. That's about 4 soccer fields. So Kowloon was about the size of half of an average Manhattan block, one of the most densely populated places on the planet. Yet, the population density in Manhattan is about 67,340 people per square mile. And in Kowloon, the density is 50 times higher. If the entire mankind lived at that density, it would fit within the state of Delaware. But let's get back to Kowloon. What happened here? How was it built? And most importantly, why? Let's delve into the history of this place to find it out. Kowloon didn't start out as what it eventually became. At first, it was just an outpost to control the salt trade 1,000 years ago. Then it was a simple coastal fort. Then, in 1842, Britain took over Hong Kong. But this small piece of land was still technically under Chinese jurisdiction. How come? China insisted that Kowloon remain under its sovereignty because it had a garrison and a customs post here. It was a symbolic declaration like, "We don't give up completely. We still have a point of influence." This resulted in a strange situation. Kowloon remained a Chinese enclave, but China could not or did not want to control it. And the British did not do anything there, respecting the agreement. The place became a legal hole, an anarchic zone where no one intervened. Originally, there was just a small group of people living here, but then the Chinese Civil War broke out and refugees flooded into Hong Kong. Many settled in Kowloon, beyond the laws and beyond the government's control. From this point on, the most impressive part of Kowloon's history began. There were more and more people who wanted to live here. In this case, any city would just grow wider and wider. But not Kowloon. It had boundaries, and construction could not be expanded beyond. Solution? Build upwards. Clearly. And that's how it all started. Every new building was built on top of the old ones, without any approved plan or even building codes, and this upward growth was very brisk. The authorities even had to negotiate with Kowloon representatives to ensure they built their houses to a height of no more than 14 stories. The planes approaching Kai Tak Airport for landing were flying dangerously close to Kowloon's high-rises.
I remember our plane was still in the air, close to landing, but I could see TV sets in buildings adjacent to the flight line on the runway.
Recalls one passenger. Kowloon soon developed into a chaotic concrete organism with life humming inside, and this life was totally beyond the control and regulation by the official authorities. What did it all look like? At first glance, Kowloon resembled a dystopian cyberpunk hell on Earth. Most of the buildings clustered so tightly that the streets below stayed in shadow forever. Inside the buildings were many windowless apartments. People literally lived like in boxes. The rooftops were used as streets where people strolled, dried laundry, and children even played ball among the forest of television antennas. Dozens of alleys were often only 3 to 6 feet wide, lit by dim lamps, and had poor drainage. A network of passageways and staircases spontaneously formed on the upper levels. It quickly grew so extensive that one could walk through the entire city from north to south without touching solid ground. If only there was a problem only with passageways and staircases. The construction of houses was not regulated in any way either. Around 350 buildings were constructed there, and most of them were built with poor foundations and minimal, if any, connection to utilities. At first, Kowloon had virtually no water supply of its own. Residents often had to walk to the nearest standpipes outside of Kowloon to fetch water. However, in the 1980s, many houses already had centralized water supply. The sewage system of Kowloon was poor and often clogged, but the residents coped with it somehow. Another major challenge was the sheer amount of garbage. It was everywhere. Residents disposed of it wherever they could, tossing it off rooftops and into the narrow gaps between buildings. Over time, it decayed, filling the air with a distinct atmosphere. Electricity posed its own set of problems. In the beginning, residents had to source it themselves. They made it illegally through chaotically laid wires connected to the Hong Kong grid. The wires stretched through alleys and roofed passageways, creating a giant spider's web. Eventually, official lines appeared, so that most people always had electricity and working appliances. Looking at this chaos of wires, one wonders how it didn't short-circuit and cause fires. This is where Kowloon's amazing phenomenon should be noted. Despite the visual mayhem, they still tried to strictly comply with fire safety regulations. The bitter experience, the fire of 1950, gave them a lesson. In one night, half of Kowloon's residents were left homeless, with hundreds more missing. The fire destroyed more than 2,500 huts, inhabited by about 3,500 families, 17,000 people. But this disaster gave new settlers the opportunity to build new housing. Not wooden, but stone, which was much safer. It even gave rise to rumors that the fire might have been set intentionally. Also, we mentioned children playing on the rooftops. But where did they study? Did they even go to school? The answer is yes, and they studied right here. Many children did their homework on the rooftops, using whatever space they could find. During the day, they attended school. Yes, there were schools in Kowloon. Some of them were opened by charity organizations, and others ran on the sheer enthusiasm of the residents. There were even weddings of varying levels of lavishness celebrated in Kowloon, just like anywhere else, with feasts, relatives, and neighbors. How and where? Right on the rooftops, turning them into a kind of open-air restaurant. Despite the extremely bizarre, not to say horrible conditions, Kowloon lived and thrived in its own way. Housing cost some money, even though it was incomparably cheaper than elsewhere in Hong Kong. For example, renting a tiny room, about 30 to 40 square feet, could cost about $4 to $13 a month. A larger apartment-like dwelling could cost up to $130. It was also possible to buy an apartment in Kowloon. A tiny unit cost as little as around $650. A medium-sized apartment went for around $2,000. The most expensive were not even the largest apartments, but the brightest ones. Housing with windows facing outwards was regarded as nearly elite. Well, by Kowloon standards, of course. Residents were desperate to get an extra piece of space by any means, and the easiest way to do it was to build some kind of balcony. Such an addition gave an extra couple of square feet, and if they were lucky, a little daylight as well. This is roughly what a typical floor plan of a residential high-rise building in Kowloon looked like. Of course, this is just one of many examples, as they varied greatly. But still, looking at this contrast between Kowloon and the adjacent neighborhoods of Hong Kong, it is impossible to believe that tens of thousands of people voluntarily lived in such conditions. Why didn't people leave this place for the incomparably more spacious neighborhoods of Hong Kong? After all, they were literally across the street. Why were people drawn to Kowloon? Who was attracted to it? Primarily refugees and people who couldn't afford anything better. They were the ones who started it all. One could settle in Kowloon without documents or permits. It was free to enter. There were no border controls. There were no guards or customs. No document checks. The perfect hideout. Illegal immigrants, fugitives, and those who needed to hide from the authorities found refuge here. But it wasn't just them. Gradually, businesses started to stream in. Kowloon was bustling with sidewalk cafes, bakeries, workshops, and even small factories. Locksmiths and electricians, tailors and shoemakers, hairdressers and street engineers, sign makers and advertisers. There were even kitchens preparing food for Hong Kong's expensive restaurants. No one wondered about the conditions the kitchens worked in. There were also doctors' offices. This place was especially targeted by illegal dentists. Why? Many of them graduated in China, but their licenses were not recognized in British Hong Kong. So they rushed into this window of opportunity. No licenses were required, rent was cheap, and there were plenty of clients. As a result, there were about 100 illegal dental clinics in Kowloon. Naturally, crime flourished here as well. Triads ruled the city, running illegal gambling dens, underground businesses, and other illicit operations. What are the triads? It's the name of Chinese organized crime groups. The name, according to one version, is derived from the symbolism of the three forces, the union of heaven, earth, and humanity. In terms of structure and influence, they can be compared to the Italian mafia, Cosa Nostra, or the Japanese Yakuza. Of course, there was no official police force. There have only been a few raids in Kowloon by the Hong Kong police over the whole time, but they made next to no impact, and frankly, they made no difference at all. The fortress city remained the same uncontrollable anomaly. But surprisingly, despite the lawlessness and seeming decay, the place wasn't completely chaotic. On the contrary, it had a special, unique order. The triads virtually substituted for local government. They kept order, resolved conflicts, and arranged many processes up to garbage collection. Of course, they were by no means saints. Kowloon was ruled by two rival and extremely violent gangs, but it wasn't just the triads that ruled the city. In most matters, the people were surprisingly effective at organizing on their own. The residents didn't feel caught up in the chaos. They said, "This is our home," and so it was, for 50 years. But could such a city exist forever? For all these 50 years, the reason for its existence was not only the issues of legal status. There are theories that Kowloon was quite useful in this state. It was an emergency valve for society. Poor people, migrants, undocumented workers were able to find their place here, and the fuzzy legal status of Kowloon contributed to turning a blind eye to it. But in the 1980s, Britain and China began discussing the return of Hong Kong to Chinese control, and that's when it became impossible to ignore Kowloon. After the final handover of Hong Kong to China, the authorities deemed Kowloon too dangerous to live in and decided it had to disappear. Residents were offered compensation, about $3,800 to $5,100 US. Many refused to leave. This chaos was home for them. It took the authorities 6 years to negotiate with the locals. The most stubborn were eventually forcibly evicted. The demolition began in 1993. The final farewell chord. Kowloon became a movie set for Crime Story with Jackie Chan. And a few weeks later, demolition began. Nowadays, there is a green park on the side of former Kowloon, part of the historic Yamen, the former residence of the Chinese authorities, from where the enclave was once governed, has been preserved. There is also a model of Kowloon, a real concrete labyrinth in miniature. Kowloon is gone. All that's left are photos, 3D models, and memories. But not only that, this labyrinth city shaped cyberpunk, from movies to games, from Blade Runner to Cyberpunk 2077. It became a symbol of the chaotic but vibrant metropolis of the future. So Kowloon has vanished, but its spirit lives on in contemporary culture.